Welcome to the Witchy Wonky Podcast, a space for spiritual raving baddies embodying all things music, manifestation, mindset, and magic. I'm your host, Rachel Brady, a digital creator and storyteller who views festivals as portals, headbanging as healing, and raving as group therapy. Whether you're deep in your spiritual journey, reframing your subconscious beliefs, or just trying to figure things out, you are in the right place. Join me today as we lock in and get weird. Hello, my angels, and welcome to another episode of the Witchy Wonky Podcast. I'm your host, Rachel Brady, and it is so good to be back in the swing of things as we open the 2026 festival season. I had such a fun time creating the mini-series Ritualize and Romanticize, which is an intuitively curated set of mini-guided meditations and visualizations that are rooted in making everyday habits like getting ready, making your morning beverage, cleaning your home, just a little bit more magical and rooted in intentionality. So if that is something that intrigues you, feel free to find that on whatever platform you are streaming this. It has been around 2 months, I want to say, since releasing the last Witchy and Wonky podcast episode. And to be honest, I really needed these past 2 months to rest out the remainder of the winter, integrate the lessons that were closing out their loop, and really just let the natural flow of this digital content take its course. I think that for a lot of creatives, there is this interesting paradox that comes with your art, writing, content, when it is available for public consumption, so to speak, because you feel like in order to carve out a space for yourself in the digital realm, you have to prioritize consistency. And I do believe there is a lot to be said about showing up for yourself, challenging your capacity to create even when circumstances aren't ideal, and showing up as a form of devotion to self and the craft. But on the other side of the same coin is this omnipresent content churning machine that sometimes feels like you are just posting just to feel relevant and feed the algorithm, even if you haven't necessarily given your art time to marinate or breathe. And the creative process, regardless of what sort of content you provide, definitely cannot be contained or fully expressed through an algorithm. So let me tell you, if you have been going through a season where you just stare at the screen, the canvas, the paper, whatever it is that you channel your divine creative energy, and you feel like they're just absolute crickets, you are definitely not alone. And I wish I had some advice, to be honest, but it has been a bit of a struggle over here as well. However, the past 2 months were absolutely necessary for me to finally have room to breathe, to feel safe in expressing myself through this podcast. I have been doing some private healing work that was very much necessary if I wanted to keep this podcast and all my other forms of content as true to myself as possible. There has been a deep sort of grief and anger that has been coming and going in waves as it relates to my personal journey and what I had been releasing and healing from. So it was really important for me to find a way to balance honoring all of that in real time, as well as use that creative energy to channel it into my work. I've had this tendency in the past to intellectualize what I'm going through as a way to avoid actually feeling it, where I dissect it and I justify, well, I'm acknowledging it and can show you what I'm supposed to be learning from it, so that totally counts, right? Meanwhile, I have so much emotion bottled up that I'm not allowing myself to feel and low-key disassociating, but hey, I have a whole thesis statement written up on why I should feel it. I'm definitely calling myself out on that, so no worries if that hits home for you as well. But I will say that allowing myself to feel the grief, the anger, the sadness, even if I had to feel it all alone at times, that is what kept me grounded throughout all of this. The crash outs were portals into a deeper understanding of myself, what I felt deprived of, and in turn, what I could advocate for in the future. So, long story short, the past 2 months I've been going through it privately, but have been so grateful to finally advocate for myself, set my boundaries rooted in self-respect, and give myself the energetic space to make this podcast and my work in general as authentic as possible. And that actually is a pretty smooth transition towards what we will be discussing today, which is how shadow work can manifest in our raving and festival journeys. This is a topic that sort of unfolded organically within these past few months, especially after my festival in February, and I really wanted to give it the time and space to breathe before creating it. After writing about it on Instagram in late March, it really resonated with a lot of you, and I feel like it is definitely one of those topics that a lot of us participate in without necessarily realizing it. So today I want to dive a little bit deeper into the basis of shadow work, my thoughts on why raving and festivals can bring out shadow parts of ourselves, and how we can use this awareness to practice integration and create a space for us to dance with our darkness. And this episode is not meant to be some sort of all-in-one instruction manual, a diagnosis of sorts, because shadow work can be deeply complex depending on your lived experience. And in my personal opinion, shadow work should not be treated like some trendy afterthought. It might require additional resources or forms of support. So before we proceed with the episode, I just want to make it clear that when we discuss the concept of shadow work and its ties into our raving and festival experience, these are only a few ways it can be expressed and integrated. So as always, take what resonates, leave what doesn't. With that, let's lock in and get weird. So the origins of shadow work are primarily sourced from the psychological concept of the shadow, which is famously coined by psychologist Carl Jung. His analytical psychology is a grand map of the unconscious and conscious mind and has many excellent in-depth podcasts, audiobooks, books that explore it deeper. But for this episode's sake, we will mainly focus on what he had to say about the shadow. And by his definition, the shadow contains a sort of unconscious archive where we store what we deem unacceptable about ourselves and hide it from our conscious mind. And these beliefs, these parts of ourselves might have been cast out during our formative years, parts of ourselves that we told were wrong and were rejected. Now, here is the kicker that has helped not only to deepen my personal understanding of shadow work, but also provide a more compassionate lens. The shadow isn't just this ugly, gross, bad part of ourselves that we're trying to completely eradicate. In fact, when we practice expression or integration, our shadow actually provides untapped clues into how we can become more creative, showcase our hidden talents, and become an overall more empathetic participant in humanity. The goal isn't to erase the shadow. If you are familiar with the law of polarity, our light cannot exist without our shadow. The goal is to bring awareness to it, to give it room to breathe and ask for what it needs. We are not aiming for dominance, we are aiming for understanding. After all, when we recognize the multitudes of our individual humanity, we are able to see that in others as well. Shadow work is also beneficial because it allows us to minimize our projections onto others. A famous quote by Carl Jung states that, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." One of the main characteristics of our shadow selves that many people don't realize is that our shadow remains unconscious until we shed light on it and bring it to the surface. So for a lot of us, when we are faced with circumstances or people that trigger our shadow selves, when we participate in self-sabotaging patterns or destructive behavior, our shadow selves are actually being provoked and driving many behaviors and beliefs without us realizing it. This often takes form of projection, which is the act of taking parts of ourselves that we deem unworthy or unattractive and projecting them onto others. Not only does this take away the opportunity to see people as their own multifaceted self, but it also leads to situations where you might become fixated on certain traits in others, create a false image of them in your head, and become frustrated when they don't act according to the script you've imposed upon them, or even feel the need to show them your supposed superiority. You can see how, if left unchecked, this could have extremely damaging effects on connections with others, and you might even have experienced it from others firsthand as well. So what do we do with this? Like I said before, there are plenty of resources that go much more in depth with professional guidance, but the most important takeaway from learning about the basics of shadow work lies in this. It can be helpful to dig deeper and gain insight into which parts of our lives our shadow selves formed, but introspection without concrete action, to put it frankly, will not improve our quality of life. We can intellectualize and psychoanalyze, but the point of shadow work isn't to write out the most journal prompts. It's to use our shadow as a guiding star towards what we truly desired before we were told to suppress it, and remain curious in how we can healthily express and integrate that. So, with this basic understanding, we can start to explore why raving and festivals have the potential to become fertile ground for shadow work. When I reflected upon this, I took both my own personal experience and other raving friends' recollections into consideration, particularly friends that also view raving as festivals as an opportunity for the discovery, healing, and expression of self. The first theme that popped out when exploring this was the essence of raving itself, how it developed as a counterculture, a safe haven for marginalized people, including people of color and the LGBTQIA+ community, rooted in community values that, sadly enough, were considered to be outside the norm in traditional American society. As a side note, I will be discussing this from an American viewpoint, but I'm hopeful that this rhetoric will still resonate with my international listeners. And so, in a way, raving at its core was always meant to be a form of shadow work because of the circumstance of its genesis, to serve as a place of expression, celebration, and liberation for the parts of people's selves that were rejected, repressed, or cast out. This is why it's so essential to not only honor and remember the roots of rave culture as a whole, but to also advocate against this sanitized hyper-commercialization of rave culture. If people don't feel safe to truly be seen, then we've fully lost the plot. In addition to its rich history, raving and festivals also provide an ample opportunity for shadow work because of one simple notion. They hold up a mirror to ourselves quickly. Because of their innate nature of encouraging authenticity, for many of us, we might become cognizant of how we've been holding ourselves back, what we're insecure about, or simply notice how free other ravers appear to be. This one particularly hit home for me as someone who is pretty neurodivergent and highly masking for the majority of my life. So if you are also a neurodivergent spiritual raving baddie, I'm sure you also empathize with the experience of either quickly realizing how you could let your guard down, or perhaps you had an initial struggle with seeing other ravers in their element and wondered how you could ever reach a similar point. So although there are a multitude of reasons as to why shadow work might manifest in your own personal raving experience, before I provide some examples, I first want to invite you to consider some reflection questions if you want to expand upon this further. Depending on how you're listening to this, you can either pause this episode and take some time to think about it, or if you just want to keep this in the back of your mind for a more appropriate time, that is completely fine as well. But allow these questions to not become some sort of homework assignment or thing you feel pressured to fix, but a chance to give yourself the space to really sit down with yourself as open-mindedly as you can. So these questions are: what challenges or triggers do I find myself repeatedly experiencing with a particularly strong emotional reaction? Was there anything that stood out to me that first felt unnatural or forced when I started my raving journey that I longed to feel more free with? Are there certain traits in other ravers that bring out a particularly strong emotional reaction in me, perhaps rooted in an insecurity of my own? And mind you, these are not meant to be questions where you put yourself down or beat yourself up. This is an opportunity to give yourself some honest self-reflection and, as we move forward with this episode, see if there are certain examples that resonate with you that you can explore more in your own time, on your own path. So with that, let's lock in and get weird as we discuss potential ways shadow work manifests in our raving journeys. The first form of shadow work in raving holds a very special place in my heart because as a dancer and someone who grew up dancing her whole life, I particularly find great healing and catharsis in this, and that is somatic dance. If you have never heard of this phrase or the word somatic in general, this means anything related to the experience of living in your body. This might look like how you're feeling tightness in your chest, your breath speeding up or halting, your hands clenching, the physical manifestation of tension or even trauma that we carry in our bodies for sometimes even years. And although there are certified somatic practitioners that go much more in depth with the facilitation of proper somatic therapy as a whole, the concept of somatic dance is very fascinating when we approach it from a raving lens. So, somatic dance, if you're able to guess, incorporates movement and dance to help regulate the nervous system, increase body awareness, and provide profound emotional and energetic release. And although this form of therapy can be held in a professional and regulated environment, I would be so bold to say that when we are immersed in the festival dimension, allowing our bodies to naturally move and let our so-called dark emotions come to the surface, we are naturally participating in a form of shadow work that gives these emotions room to express and integrate. So this is why, especially as a bass head or someone who loves bass music or dubstep, I absolutely love the culture of headbanging and mosh pits, because to the outsider, they might seem chaotic or dangerous, but as I'm sure you can ask any person rooted in the metal scene as well, these forms of dance have their own subculture of rules and expectations that prioritize a regulated environment for catharsis. After all, one of the golden rules of mosh pits is that when somebody falls, you immediately help them back up. It's an ebb and flow of energy, a volcanic rupture and release, a sort of dubstep rage room, if you will. And we create a space in the raving and festival scene where these are not only encouraged, but a form of bonding as well. As with all forms of dance, headbanging is its own sort of language of appreciation, a form of camaraderie that at times speaks louder than a conversation ever could. This is why I personally view headbanging, a very primal and power-based form of dance, as one of my favorite releases of energy, particularly that of anger. There have been multiple times where I felt the anger, the rage, the grief, many complicated emotions that had been hidden away, seen as too much, be able to finally come to the surface, and not necessarily any sort of verbal expression, but be carried through the body and finally released in a way that felt as if they were honored, but not overwhelming. Because sometimes it's not necessarily about intellectualizing or analyzing your shadow, but rather just giving it room to dance. The next example of shadow work through raving has to do what is known as the visibility wound. Now, if you aren't familiar with this phrase, it lies in the unconscious belief that it is unsafe to be seen, that it is safer to play small, be invisible, and shrink ourselves in order to know our needs are being met, whether that's safety, connection, and belonging, or anything that we feel is threatened if we were to step into our most authentic selves, speak up, and show up in ways that we deep down long to do. And this idea of a visibility wound ties in to what Carl Jung called the persona, which is defined as the social mask an individual adopts to meet certain expectations and manage how we are seen by others. Now, in my personal opinion, personas aren't necessarily something that we need to eradicate, nor are they inherently wrong. In fact, for many of us, adopting certain personas in certain environments might be seen as necessary as a form of safety, depending on factors involved. However, Jung proposed that in shadow work, understanding these masks was an essential step towards what he called individuation, which is defined as a lifelong psychological process of developing a unique, stable identity separate from family, culture, and social conditioning aimed at achieving wholeness and self-actualization. In short, the journey of integrating our shadow and our conscious selves to become one's true, authentic self. So let's look at this from a raving lens now. As we discussed before, both in this episode and in my content altogether, rave culture and festival culture involves creating a sort of dimension, a safe haven for self-exploration and liberation. This includes being able to notice where our visibility wounds start to feel triggered, particularly at the start of a raving journey. I know that for a lot of people, myself included, there can be a surface level commercialized aesthetic that sort of serves as the first level of the dimension, so to speak. You might feel the pressure to look a certain way, act a certain way, be seen a certain way. You might notice certain personas want to grab the spotlight or make decisions that don't feel aligned with you. And I will say, as a side note, that there is definitely a gray area that will require some discernment on your part. I believe there is a difference between doing things outside your comfort zone as a form of challenging insecurities and upgrading your identity, and then there's when it goes completely off your moral compass. So just take that into consideration as we talk about this. However, going back to the visibility wound, we start to notice the ways that we might have in the past felt like we needed to downplay or dim ourselves, whereas when we are put in an environment where these traits are, in fact, encouraged and celebrated, we realize that those parts of our shadow, when welcomed, can actually be some of our strongest sources of power and connection. If you also add the neurodivergent lens to this, speaking as a neurodivergent girly, you also experience the unmasking that occurs when you enter a space, a festival or raving dimension that is able to hold that, and even if the energy ebbs and flows, it is rooted in those pillars of self-celebration that are unfortunately denied or suppressed by modern society. This is also when you notice rave fashion thrive as people become more in tune with how they choose to authentically express themselves, where people practice flow arts, shuffle, create art, showcase their talents in a way that had been seen in the past as too unrealistic, unnecessary, over the top, or extra, because that is one of the most beautiful characteristics of shadow work that we discussed earlier. It is not about ridding ourselves of the shadow, but allowing us to clue in to what would help us feel seen and heard, because sometimes the darkness, when alchemized, creates the most vibrant forms of self-expression. The third example of shadow work and raving involves a very potent yet often misunderstood method, and that is unlocking inner child healing with whimsy. Now, if you are new to the Witchy and Wonky universe, we are huge fans of whimsy here. We love whimsy maxing and finding ways to incorporate it into our everyday lives. However, when I discuss the concept of whimsy and how it relates to shadow work here, it contains this paradox of the skill to not take life so seriously, but also know that it is, in fact, that deep. As I'm sure you can imagine, shadow work and listening to what our inner child needs are closely related. After all, a large portion of our shadow self was in fact developed during early childhood years, perhaps adolescence, where we were told by either our primary caretakers, our schools, or people of authority, even other children, that there were parts of us that were unacceptable, to be repressed and ultimately rejected. And there can indeed be a complex layer of trauma that comes with this territory, which of course has a time and a place to be processed either with professional support in your own due time. However, if we want to apply this to the raving lens, you might be able to start to connect the dots as to how the connections formed and forms of expression have a great deal with working with the inner child. So let's start with connection. I remember someone recently saying that making friends at a festival or a rave sometimes feels like a kindergarten recess, which honestly is the perfect encapsulation of reclaiming this sort of pure interaction that doesn't ask us to hide away or shrink. I cannot tell you how many times I have complimented someone's outfit, received a tiny trinket, or simply sang and danced along with somebody only to have that connection blossom into a deep friendship that, in the real world, might have been considered a simple, fleeting moment. In the festival dimension, we are given permission to let our inner child take the wheel. Not necessarily in an immature way, but in a way that returns to the self that we embodied before we were told how we must show up in this world. And this is where the act of whimsy as a form of shadow work also comes in, When we create an environment that encourages whimsy, suspends our disbelief, and allows us to, in a way, make pretend, we are tapping into that childlike sense of openness and openly defying the programming that made us hide away these qualities in the darkness. Whimsy is, in fact, a form of rebellion and allows us to reclaim those parts of ourselves and, in fact, realize that those parts held the key towards the connection we craved so much as children. And this was an extremely eye-opening and healing process for myself. As someone who was bullied by other kids since preschool, I developed a deep inner shame that transferred into my own shadow of constantly feeling rejected, overlooked, and unappreciated. However, the connections formed in my raving and festival journeys did not require any certain achievements, any certain aesthetic, or needing to show up as this perfect, cool girl that never showed any sort of dark emotion. It truly allowed me to unmask, let my inner child take center stage, and show her that she has love surrounding her just as she is. So the next time you allow yourself to participate in this form of play, the commitment to the bit, the recess of the rave, I want you to take a moment to talk to your inner child. Tell them how this is for the both of you, that they get a front row seat to witnessing the connection and joy that comes with finally finding an environment that celebrates what they were told to hide for so long. The final form of shadow work in our raving journey I saved for last because for this past year, it was the most prominent form that showed up in my personal journey that truly helped me break past barriers, pinpoint where I was abandoning myself, and move forward with a bit more integration and authenticity under my belt. And that is navigating triggers in our rave relationships. When I say relationships, I don't necessarily mean romantic. After all, many of us ravers develop what we call rave families, groups of friends that become chosen family that we tend to plan all of our festivals or shows with, as well as rave friendships with people that we might see every once in a while, but are always happy to catch up with like no time has passed. Finding a rave family or cultivating connections in the community in general is inarguably one of the biggest blessings that many of us might have not ever even thought that we would be capable of. However, in the true spirit of the law of polarity that states everything inevitably contains its opposite, these connections can also bring forth painful triggers, conflicts, and insecurities that seem to cut even deeper because of how close our bonds have become. And this is where, like we discussed in the introduction of this episode, we can notice both our shadow self and the shadow selves of others come to the surface in the form of self-sabotaging patterns, destructive behavior, and the projection of insecurities onto others. This might even feel more intense when we take into consideration the mental, emotional, and physical toll festivals might have on us, so it is very important to keep that in mind as well. The goal of navigating these triggers is to not necessarily avoid or bypass them altogether, but to treat the ones that seem to arrive in patterns as a teacher. One particular cue that can be helpful to start out is noticing where we tend to have intense emotional reactions, such as irrational anger, defensiveness, or a shutdown. And mind you, I am absolutely not a mental health professional in the slightest, so if you feel like your anger or other intense emotions would benefit from additional support, I will always encourage that. However, even just bringing our awareness to noticing whichever particular topic, action, or even person consistently triggers us begins the journey towards stepping away from a place of reaction and into a place of response. Like the quote we had mentioned before, until we make the unconscious conscious, until we take a moment to look back and witness our shadow, we will constantly exist in a state of reactivity, martyrdom, and projection. Ever since I moved back to the States almost 1 year ago, which is even wild to say, I was quickly met with many real-life triggers that were not present during my time abroad during festival season. And although it is absolutely vital to practice self-advocacy and speak up with how others have hurt us, it was also my responsibility to look within and ask myself, why were these certain things resonating so painfully in me? Why was I internalizing these certain things and letting them fester? And these moments of reflection inadvertently started a season of deep shadow work throughout my festival journey. There were some festivals where I could feel the integration, and other times where I just felt like a complete shell of myself, wondering how I could possibly view these triggers as a portal towards a higher timeline. For this particular form of shadow work, I want to share some of the biggest aids that came to the surface as I navigated this dark season from pretty much July until March. The first one, which might seem a bit obvious, was communicating with as much integrity as I could. And when I say integrity, I don't mean trying to say the perfect thing all the time, but rather speaking as openly and honestly as possible. This was so important because although we can never control how somebody else thinks about us, we can put forth energy that is rooted in authentic expression to the best of our ability. Speaking with integrity, both with those that triggered me and with conversations that helped me process these situations as a whole, allowed me to bring forth the shadow part of myself that always felt like she could never speak up, that her needs didn't matter, and that she would be punished or cast out for standing up for herself. The second component that was very helpful was having space away. I am so blessed to be able to have so many rave friends and groups all around the world. However, it was so necessary for me to be able to find time to retreat, regroup, and recharge. Like we mentioned before, festivals in general can be overstimulating and intense, so being able to take a step back and look at the bigger picture allowed me to not only track patterns of where I was feeling triggered or insecure, but also grant a much needed perspective that wasn't immersed in the bubble of the situation, if that makes sense. The third most important factor that went into my personal shadow journey was simple, yet it changed everything. I owned my darkness and stood on business for it. And this is coming from someone who grew up the non-confrontational final boss. If you couldn't guess, my shadow self was terrified to speak up, would constantly abandon herself, and would do anything to keep the peace, even if her inner world was completely tormented. And this season of shadow work looked me in the face and said, "You have the power, you've met your lightness and your darkness. Now, more than ever, you must honor what you felt unworthy of." And it's wild because for me, a lot of the boundaries I was finally able to set, the energy I was able to reclaim, the experiences I was able to advocate for, felt so selfish and awkward at first, when in fact, as things did begin to fall into place, it started to feel so natural and almost like a no-brainer. And this is what happens when we stop chasing the light without honoring the dark. We start to truly tap into the flow. For the flow innately also contains contrast. It contains dips and peaks, death and rebirth, yin and yang. When we start to see these triggers, these intense emotional responses, as an opportunity to get curious with what our unconscious is trying to communicate, we participate in both the festival dimension and the real world dimension in a much more grounded, liberated state. So these are some of the most prominent ways that I've personally observed shadow work manifesting in our raving and festival journeys. It is, of course, not a complete, fully comprehensive list, but hopefully it can help spark some introspection on your end if you've resonated with it. There is indeed a time and a place for this sort of work, so I'm definitely not suggesting that we all must dive into this deep inner work while we're just trying to have fun at a rave. However, if there are certain parts of your raving journey that you have felt a bit disconnected from, insecure about, or there are parts of your raving journey that you've seen in others that you feel a quiet call towards, let this be a guiding point towards reflecting on what you might be able to do this festival season that honors these shadow parts of yourself. Whether that's allowing yourself to feel seen, finally taking your power back, or letting your inner child play, there are many ways you can dance with your darkness. Thank you so much for listening. I am so thrilled to be back into the swing of things in developing these podcast episodes. They are pretty dense, but I do my best to be as intentional with them, so the development does take a bit of time. but it is always a joy to be able to blend rave culture, psychology, spirituality, and magic into a form of digital media that can help provoke thought for other spiritual raving baddies. If you'd like to catch up with me on my other social media, you can find me both on TikTok and on Instagram under the handle Witchy and Wonky. All the links you need are available in the show notes. And with that, I'm Rachel Brady, and thank you so much for listening.